Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for participating in the National Association of State Facilities Administrators Learning Series. NASFA is an association dedicated exclusively to the state facilities professionals and the unique challenges they face. Our members are responsible for the planning, development, operation, and maintenance of state facilities and infrastructure. Today's webinar is titled, A Roadmap for Optimizing Your Real Estate Portfolio. I'm Bert Jones from Virginia and NASFA's current president. I will be the moderator for this webinar. A few logistics about the webinar. We will answer questions at the end of the presentation. However, feel free to submit your questions during the presentation. To ask a question, please type your question in the questions box on your dashboard and press the send button. The webinar is being recorded and will be posted on NASFA's website under the Learning Series tab. So now let's go ahead and get started, and I'll let our presenters for the day introduce themselves. Thank you all for participating, and thank you to our presenters.
Thank you, Bert. This is Chris Zajas of Leland Consulting Group. We are a strategic planning real estate advisory firm based here in Portland, Oregon. I've met many of you, I hope, at the national conference back in June. The panel that we have for you today is representatives of Leland Consulting Group and Cushman Wakefield. Our two firms have formed a partnership several years ago to directly address strategic planning issues for real estate for public agencies, namely states, but also cities, counties, and other entities that all face similar issues. We're going to talk a little bit about our process for strategic planning for portfolio optimization and give you a little bit of a case study of the work that we've done here in Oregon for the state of Oregon. And that's why we have Shannon Ryan here today, and I'll let her introduce herself and then following with the rest of the team.
Morning, good afternoon. I am Shannon Ryan, and I'm the administrator for Enterprise Asset Management at the Department of Administrative Services here in Oregon. As Chris mentioned, this team has been together for a little over 3 years. We reached out to them leaving Oregon, reached out 3 or 4 years ago to help us figure out what we needed to figure out. And the process that came from that is what you will see today. But I just wanted to highlight that in that these people here in the room came together as a team, and we are still working as a team as Oregon continues to evolve and continue to improve in its own process.
Good morning. This is Mark Carnesi with Cushman Wakefield. Cushman Wakefield helps to implement the strategic plan that has been prepared by the team. In order to implement this plan, we prepared a framework in which to complete a transaction that takes full advantage of market realities and achieves the goals identified. I've been in real estate for about 20 years and focus on completing transactions.
Good morning, this is Doug Durwater. I'm also with Cushman Wakefield. I've been with the organization for 15 years, and I'm a part of the implementation part of the team in the process in working with the state of Oregon.
This is Matt Johnson, also with Cushman Wakefield. I focus primarily on the evaluation portion of a project, and today I'll be talking a little bit about our agenda. So when we talk about a roadmap for optimizing the real estate portfolio, essentially we're talking about the process that Chris referenced, where we're putting a strategic process in place to help get our arms around, or our clients' arms around what they really have, do an internal assessment on stakeholder outreach, put a strategy and a plan in place to accomplish it, actually implement it, and then follow up with ongoing reporting and continued improvement. I'd like to note that for this particular topic, a lot of what we're talking about relates to the state of Oregon. The particular drivers and goals they identified were centered around cost saving and changing the leasing process. This process, this roadmap produces different goals, different drivers, different outcomes for different groups. So I don't want you to think that the focus is primarily on changing the leasing process. However, it's the case study that we'll be discussing today. Lastly, I'd like to note we're looking forward to the Q&A section of this program. We would also welcome any feedback. A lot of these steps, when we were putting this webinar together, we really could do a deep dive and spend 30 minutes on each step. We decided to take a step back, cover them at a high level, but would appreciate any feedback if there's interest in exploring any of these further.
So this is Chris again. The first thing that we want to do in a strategic planning process is ask the question, why are we doing this? What is most important to states and facility administrators as it relates to their real estate portfolio? On the screen are some of the common topics that we hear related to that. A lot of these we heard at the national conference back in June when we spoke with you. But they're very varied, and they're going to change depending on, they're going to change from state to state, agency to agency. Some of them may be things related to employee recruitment and retention and alternative workplace strategies. We know that for a lot of agencies, employee recruitment is a challenge, as a lot of the baby boomers are retiring, and it's a tight job market in a lot of parts of the country. The quality and type and locations of your workspaces can be a very significant driver for attracting and retaining key employees, and so that directly factors into a real estate portfolio strategy. Others, and this was the case in Oregon, is we simply want to find cost savings, ways to save when states are continually facing tighter budgets. And also, we know that states are bureaucratic animals. I'll say that in our private sector clients, that's also the case too, so it's not unique to public agencies. But reporting is often a big challenge, and how do we report real estate, which is technical and complex, and make it digestible and informative to the various stakeholders that need to hear it.
And really, there's not one among us that doesn't come up against regulatory constraints. So many times we know what we want to do, what we should do, what we wish we could do, and our hands are tied by the various regulatory constraints around us. Funding uncertainties also, I think, plague us constantly. Even in good times, you're wondering, when are the good times not going to be good anymore? For example, and it's not just a budgetary cycle, it can be pending legislation. There's a measure pending right now in Oregon that could either make us more flush than we've ever been, or we're looking at a 7% budget cut next biennium. It could go either way. So that certainly causes angst around putting together that strategic plan, and never anything that we can ever take our eye off the ball. And legislative pressures. I will tell you from Oregon's perspective, as we rolled out our optimization plan, legislative pressures were probably the largest hurdle for us to contend with. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later, but the communication and education piece around that was enormous.
So this is Doug speaking, and I'm going to go through, on a high level, the 5-step process, really the roadmap for how we go through the strategic planning. And you know, this process really is the same from a high-level standpoint, but as you get into the details, they're going to vary state by state, agency by agency, client by client, quite frankly, and it gets morphed as we work through working with our clients. So in the first step, it's the assessment, and really what we're talking about here is where you are today. And Shannon and Chris will go through it in a little bit more detail, but we're really trying to understand, you know, where you stand today, what you have that you're working with, and what are the challenges that you're facing, and how can we make a difference in that. The second step is stakeholder outreach. Shannon's going to speak to this, and this is very much an important stage of engaging your stakeholders and cultivating the champion that's going to help you see this through the execution of the strategy as you get through it. The third step, this is developing an execution strategy and process. Matt's going to go into some detail about that, and this is really where the core analysis takes place, and we really develop the action plan for the goals that we lay out and set forth as a team. The fourth step is implementation, and Shannon and Chris will go through this as well. And when partnered with your stakeholders in this, it's really time to put all the systems and procedures and policies in place as you go and put this into real life action. The fifth step, Chris will go through this, and it's the ongoing reporting. And this is really the closed loop process of this, where you be able to identify all the successes and report back all the successes you have, as well as find room where you can identify additional successes and maybe areas you can improve. And I think this is really the opportunity as we gel as a group and working together to reset and ensure we're all driving towards the same goal, and making sure that goal is even the goal you want to continue to go after.
Okay, so step one, the assessments. For us, for Oregon, we knew one thing. We knew two things. We knew we had a lot of leases, and we suspected that we were paying way too much for them. And that is pretty much literally where we started at the beginning of the assessment. And so it was very much an exercise in obviously portfolio analysis, but is also an internal process around how do we get from point A to point B. But the first part was the actual looking at our lease portfolio. It could be different for you all. It could be your equity assets or something else. But for us, that was the largest hanging piece of fruit there was. And so we really, with the help of Cushman as well as Leland, we kind of pushed that piece out to them and said, here's all of our stuff. Here's all of our leases. Please sort through it and make sense of it for us. Not that we couldn't do it, but as I'm going to get into in step 2, which you probably all painfully know, is that you need to have a third-party consultant confirm what you believe to be true, validate what you believe to be true, to really get momentum. So they were invaluable with that piece. But part of the softer side, I guess, of the assessment, outside of the the hardcore analytics, was really understand what you're looking at internally. That is as important as the actual work product that is the analysis. For example, you need to understand your regulatory constraints, which I touched upon before, but you also need to take a good hard look at your talent pool. And these people, many of them may have been there many, many years. There is legacy protocol and beliefs and practices, and nobody's doing anything wrong. But when you're looking at a wholesale change to your program, it becomes as much a change management initiative as it does a real estate initiative. And that's really where my role throughout this optimization initiative, that was really my primary role at the end of the day, was to help be that change agent. You also need to look at your internal politics, and not just legislative pressures that I mentioned before, but change is hard, and some people have very vested interests in very specific parts of a process or whatnot that might not even seem like they should care. But I will tell you from my experience that I met resistance in very unexpected places within my own agency, and certainly with other agencies too, as this change was pushed forward. So to the extent that you can, take a very, very good look at the landscape and understand how, kind of project out a little bit how this is all going to come together. The other thing that we need to realize when we're assessing ourselves is, don't just look at the bad stuff, like what's the resistance, where where are you going to run into static, but think of the other side too, in our enormous buying power. I think that sometimes we forget that. I know Oregon didn't realize that it was the largest tenant in the state of Oregon, and wow, if we flex our muscle a little bit or even just exercise reason, we can really move the dial quite a bit. So I think that's also a super, super important piece for us all to remember as well.
Great. So this is Matt. At the conclusion of the first step, a workbook is produced. Well, it's different based on the assessment and really what it finds. At its core, it has looked at the portfolio, done enough of an analysis and industry benchmarking to make sense of it, and identified the goals and the drivers. As we mentioned with the state of Oregon, one of the primary drivers was cost savings, but we also had to be mindful that 33% of employees were going to retire in the next 5 years. So that was a consideration for us as well.
Okay, so step 2, stakeholder outreach. I mentioned it earlier, and I can't stress enough that looking back over what we've done over the last 3 or 4 years, I really don't think that we'd be in the place we are now had we not had a champion. We actually had several champions. That is the most key piece, for me anyway, in this entire process. So what we did to cultivate that champion was to take the product from step 1 in our own very thoughtful internal analysis around our strengths. So it was basically a SWOT analysis internally, and then what Cushman and Leland brought forth to help us build the case. So at this point, we started selling, and fortunately, we were in an environment where our leadership heard and they paid attention. So we had leadership, or sorry, we had champions at a couple of different levels. So we had in Oregon, we have this body that's called the Enterprise Leadership Team, and it's comprised of the directors of the 25 largest agencies. And their focus is on understanding how and figuring out how to get to a place where we move together as a state, as a singular company versus, say, 82 independent little holding companies. And so that's really their focus, and they were looking for opportunities across the state to improve government in any way, shape, or form. So we were blessed to already have that forum available to us, brought our case forward, and said, you know, if we course correct a little bit, if we just change the way we approach real estate, we can achieve enormous savings, and it was a number that got everybody's attention in the room. And so it was championed by all 25 of them and treated as a formal project, which I think was key to its success as well. It wasn't just the, oh, hey, we're doing this thing. It was very, very structured in that it had, of course, the sponsors, and it had charter, and it had delineated goals per quarter around reporting and metrics. And so it was, and there were touchback places every quarter. Go back to your same champion and say, here's what we're doing. Here's how it's going. And over the course of time, what started out as kind of a, yeah, okay, this is probably a good idea, cultivated excitement like crazy over the next year, and like they couldn't wait to see what we were doing and how much we had saved and what was changing. And so it really helped to build momentum to push it out to the agencies, which is the second champion that we had, was at the peer level. So we had the directors and then the people who actually make the rubber hit the road. So it would have been the DAS real estate peers in other agencies. What's interesting with that is in the beginning, they were there, I'm pretty sure, because their directors told them to be. And so it was tentative collaboration, I think, at best. But again, in the end, everyone was engaged. Everyone had a voice at the table. It really helped to break down, I think, legacy interpretations or impressions of DAS. And I don't know if maybe you all struggle with that as well. But it was also an iterative process. And what came out of this work group of peers were changes to suggestions for changes to our regulatory constraints and our administrative rules, all which got implemented. Everyone had a voice in it, and so the buy-in factor was huge. So Again, it's painful for everyone, but the more stakeholders, the more champions you have, the better success you're going to have. At least that's my experience.
This is Matt. So once a comprehensive assessment has been completed, both of the portfolio and internally, and you have the support on board to accomplish whatever your drivers, your goals that you've identified are, we suggest developing an execution strategy and process, which is really a mechanism to accomplish your drivers. For us, with the state of Oregon, this is done in partnership with Shannon, excuse me, but also with NASFA brokers, our counterparts working within the state. One of the things that our assessment revealed is they had 2 to 3 times the workload of what you would expect to find in the private sector. And we really worked with them to understand what we could do to take some of that work away from them so it could be more manageable and reasonable to expect somebody to complete. We touch on with the state of Oregon, it involved modifying the leasing process. However, in many instances, it could simply just be regulatory constraints or rules, regulations that are a hindrance rather than a help.
Yeah, and for us too, around the specific actions. So we had our assessment done, and it became very apparent that we could accomplish all the cost savings. And then as we started to engage with our peer work group, with the other agencies, all these other opportunities surfaced. Because as you all know, everything is connected. So then we started talking about, well, we need to modernize. We need alternative workplace strategies. We need to focus in on retention. We need to do something about, X, Y, and Z. The list went on and on. So around specific actions, you really need to prioritize and make yourself stop and say, okay, wait, what's step one? Which is what we had to do, because we started to kind of spin ourselves in circles because we want to do everything all at once, and you just simply can't. So we focused in on the cost savings as phase 1, and now we're rolling into phase 2, which is really more around alternative workplace strategies. Well, because of the millions that we've saved just by our course correction and our optimization, we've got money to now fund some of that alternative workplace strategies, which is going to, dovetail into the recruitment retention, the evolving workplace. It kind of goes on. So I guess the caution for me would be to certainly prioritize those actions that you want to pursue.
So this is Chris again. The next step in the process that we're outlining is implementation. It's pretty straightforward. It's self-evident that is carrying out the recommendations and the policies and the actions that you developed over the course of the first 3 steps. But it doesn't happen on its own. In all of our work, we have too many examples of the proverbial plan that sits on a shelf, that good intentions that don't get executed for a whole range of reasons. And this speaks to Shannon's comment about sort of turning it into a project. It has stakeholders. It has recognition. It has budgeting. It has staff resources made available to it. That's really essential to institutionalizing change, if it is change that we're talking about, and making sure that it gets carried out over time. And over time is typically a multi-year process. It's not just a do it once and you're done, but we're talking about ongoing improvement. And we'll speak to that in just a moment. And so that last step is the evaluation. It's like I said, a good strategy is not a static process. It's one that fosters continuous improvement and continuous reporting. So a few of the elements of that are, one is what we call re-benchmarking, but going back to that assessment in step 1 on at least an annual basis, if not potentially quarterly, for some targeted updates. Particularly when we're talking about real estate, where market conditions are changing rapidly, economic conditions are changing rapidly. We need to make sure that we're still benchmarking to current conditions and not something that's a couple years old. And that needs to be an embedded, formal part of the process. We also need to update the strategy. We're talking about an implementation plan that has tasks and actions and responsibilities. Over the course of the year, you're going to complete projects. You're going to have successes. So check those boxes off. Take the midterm projects and the long-term projects and move them forward to the short term now that you have capacity and you've completed things. And then a really big, if not the most significant part about it is the reporting and the communication aspect of communicating upwards to your legislators or your superiors about the successes that you've achieved, whether that's cost savings or it's project completions, but also tooting your own horn internally for morale and just internal communications to remind people why we're doing this, why we're making these changes, is to achieve these positive outcomes, whatever they are, whatever the metric is that you've developed in the first couple steps of the process. Revisit them, memorialize them, and communicate them to your stakeholders so that, one, they realize the benefits, but also that sustains the program over the long haul, particularly in a government setting where your stakeholders are changing potentially every couple of years. That track record and that history of communications is absolutely essential.
And you know, for me, for Oregon too, part of this evaluation and this continued improvement is asking yourself, hey, is this still working for you? If you've used brokers or a third-party consultant, is that still working for you? Are you getting at what you wanted to get at in the first place? And if so, and the landscape has changed, and you're in your next iteration, go back to that square one. Like, what brought you there in the first place? You wanted to innovate in some way, shape, or form. So part of this evaluation, continued improvement, is not letting go of that innovation, and don't say, okay, just because we wanted to do X, we achieved it, and now this is the way we do things. I think I'm fairly new to the government. I've been with the government for 5 years, and I think that the one thing that we can do to better do our jobs is to continue to innovate and not let this become just another process that we need to do. It's morphing, it's changing, and it's organic. It certainly is for Oregon. We're still doing it, and hopefully I think we're still improving ourselves, and we've got a long ways to go. But it really is a testament over our last 3 or 4 years journey as to how this really can work for you as well.
So to conclude the presentation, this is Chris again, I wanted to recap the 5 steps and before we jump into the Q&A portion of the webinar. So again, it's starting with that assessment, identifying your goals, and identifying where you are and what the opportunity is for change. Once that opportunity has been articulated and quantified, is you build the case for it and you get your leadership behind you so that you can implement the new policies and procedures and projects over time. Step 3 is, once that leadership has got your back, define more precisely what that implementation plan is, a multi-year phased action plan with the specifics to guide your staffing, your capital, leasing, and other projects. Step 4, of course, is carrying it out. And then as you're carrying it out, report back, update your strategy, and to make sure that you're reflecting current conditions and that your stakeholders are all the benefits that are happening. So at this point, just before we jump into Q&A, I want Shannon to talk just briefly about the idea of a forum.
Yeah, so I would love to hear from all of you. I know that we have the capacity to do so via the email blast and through NASFA, which are fantastic. And we're also working with them to see if we can maybe set up a blog or something that's a little more iterative But I would love to be able to just chat, have an ongoing conversation with you all about any aspects of what we presented today, or just your thoughts, concerns around not just leasing, but really any aspect of your real estate. So you see my email address up there. If you are interested in this, I guess I'll call it a chat room, blog spot, something to be determined, please send me an email, and I'll aggregate all of those and see if we can't set something up. And with that, well, I guess we'll open it for questions.
Okay, if anybody has any questions, please go to the bottom right corner of your screen and type in your question and push the send button so we can take them. One question that I have is, did you, in the work that went on in Oregon, did you ever run a final analysis of, once you had gone through the efforts, of what you ended up with, where you started in total square feet per employee in your facilities, and where you ended up in total square feet per employee in your buildings?
Okay, so this initiative was around our private sector leases. So we didn't particularly take a look at our owned facilities in this phase of the initiative. What we were really, the metric we were really after was the cost savings in the private sector portfolio for this part of the initiative.
But did you do the calculation in the private sector leases to get to understand what your footprint per employee is in those leases?
So yes and no. The private sector leases, and this was one of the initiative's challenges, to be quite frank, and really a challenge across the board, is visibility and transparency into the agency's need. So with us, we don't do the lease administration at this point for the lease portfolio, the private lease portfolio. So we know going in approximately how many people are there. It's always a question that we pose to our agencies, and sometimes we get the answer, well, it's hard to say. I mean, that is a really tough number that we chase, and if anybody has any thoughts or ideas around that, that would be fantastic. But that's one of the metrics that we are trying to extract from that portfolio, as well as within our own. Our own is easier to do, quite frankly. We have benchmarked that, and we're at about, right now we're about at 205 square feet per person. That's the mean.
Okay.
It's as large as 300, and it's as small as 150 in some places. So that's the next phase of this initiative, is to shrink our footprint, both in the private and the public portfolio. And so we're adopting new space, not standards, but guidelines, to get us on a glide path to 175 per person. That is the goal through our alternative workplace strategies.
Okay, very good. Thank you. That was, we in Virginia over the last probably decade or more, our Division of Real Estate Services and Department of General Services has been doing a very similar protocol, and I'm sure that some of the folks in DRES would be more than happy to share some of the information that they have.
Yeah, that would be fantastic. We're just getting started, so we would love all the help we can get.
Yeah, and this is Chris. I would say one of the lessons learned from our initial benchmarking research at the beginning of the process was that when the goal is cost savings, we all read about alternative workplaces and the shrinking footprint per employee, and we were thinking that was going to be one of the main ways to save money, is just put more people into less space. And as we found, particularly as we benchmarked and looked at what the private sector is doing and what other states are doing, is that was a component of saving money, but there were a lot of other places as well, just in benchmarking leases to current market, as well as other space utilizations, whether that's storage, getting tenant improvements and things like that. But there were a lot of other ways that we achieved cost savings beyond just space per plate.
Okay, and I do have another question here from Lee Fairborn. Please explain your renewal option strategy with third-party leases, and do you have a fixed rate or a percentage of FMV?
Sure, this is
I'm
Matt.
assuming that's fair market value.
That sounds right. Sure, this is Matt. So typically what we've found is on the renewal option strategy, again, sitting down with our counterparts at the state, the DAS brokers, and getting feedback from an agency on what their goals are with the location. Assuming it's going to be a renewal, we found that we have to, we can't go by the letter of the lease and negotiate with a fixed rate or a percentage of fair market value. Fair market value is subjective, and when the landlord identifies it, it tends to be high. We found that we get better results by going back out to the market, leveraging their market, and then renegotiating the lease rather than exercising the option. As Shannon mentioned earlier, it leverages the state buying power. We're really, given their size and their credit, we should be getting better than market terms. And it also considers concessions that oftentimes aren't included in renewal options in terms of free rent or a tenant improvement allowance if needed.
Okay, do we have any other questions from the participants on the call? Looks like we've made some contact between the Virginia Division of Real Estate Services and Shannon already as we've gone through the effort. But would love to hear any other questions that anyone else may have that we can get our presenters to respond to before we wrap up the webinar.
This is Matt again, and I just wanted to make one note of something we didn't mention. We talked a lot about, the cost savings and the drivers for the state of Oregon, and now, phase 2, where we're focusing on other things. But I think I hope one of the things that our collective teams are really thankful for is we began this project 3 or 4 years ago, and the vast majority of all the people on all sides that are involved were involved at the beginning or still involved now. And I think that that's a big success for us, is that we still get to work collectively as a team.
Well, that is in the efforts that I've been involved with here in Virginia. I have found the same thing. If you don't keep people involved and don't have a continuum of effort, then you will have problems. So I do have a couple of more questions that have popped in. One from John Boyle that says, how does the state of Oregon determine if a state agency should build a new building, purchase an existing building, or enter into a long-term lease of a building?
Okay, so that's a super interesting question that butts up against legislative constraints, political constraints, and budgetary constraints. But in a nutshell, and we struggle with this, I will tell you, we struggle with this every day. There are places throughout our state, as I'm sure in all of your states, where you have a very long-term need, and you're going to be there for forever, so you should probably own it. I mean, that's a very rudimentary analysis, obviously. But just tangentially, we cannot we can't build just by free will. Even when we make the analysis, we do the buy versus lease, our own versus lease analysis. I can't tell you how many of those we have done and put forth as this is something that we really need to do. And there is zero, most of the time, there is zero appetite to do so. Political appetite, because we would have to compete for bonding and bonding capacity, and there has not been the political will within my agency, which is tasked with building on behalf of the state, or the entire state. There hasn't been the political will to bring forth a case to say, hey, we need to build a building at X place for Y agency, and here's why, and here's the business case why. And so we butt up against that all the time. It's very frustrating, and quite frankly, one of the reasons that our portfolio, private lease portfolio, is as large as it is, because we can't build even when we know we should. Now, with that said, I will say that we have a policy option package put forth for this next session, and our session will begin in February 17. We put forth a package that outlines the need for a new building on our Capitol Mall. This will be the first time the state has built anything since 1992, I think, or maybe 95. Not that we don't need to. We've got a plethora of land. We've got a ton of demand because our lease portfolio is roughly twice the size of our owned portfolio. Lots of opportunities to have an appreciable asset for the state and do it at a lower cost. But we just haven't been able to get there quite yet on the political front. So I don't know if that answers your question or not. I guess we dial it back to the lease versus own, certainly, and we look at the agency's long-term use. And more often times than not, it does make more sense to own. We're kind of not there yet. I'm hoping that'll be Oregon 2.0 at some point.
Okay, thank you very much. We have a couple of other questions. Catherine Lynn in Alabama asked, are you considering leasing strategies for state-owned properties?
Okay, so leasing strategies. Could I ask her to clarify the question? What I will tell you, what we are doing for state-owned properties is all of our state-owned. We have almost zero vacancy. Honestly, we have, I think it's like 2% vacancy rate. So the best thing that we can do for our state agency or state-owned buildings is to economize what we have via the alternative workplace strategies, which was kind of phase 2 of the initial initiative that we went through. So that's really our focus in the state-owned at this point, just because we would love to have another building that we needed to lease out, but we don't. There's no room at the inn, as it were. I don't know if that answered the question or not.
Okay, well, we'll find out. And we have another question from Carl in Virginia. Does the state of Oregon co-locate multiple agencies under one lease or within one leased property?
Yeah, go ahead.
Sure, this is Matt. I can fill this one. So the short answer is yes, and built into the process that our teams put together is an analysis, an initial analysis when we do a market analysis to look at what potential options are on the market or we can create. We also evaluate every state lease that is within, depending on the size and the market, for example, a 5-mile radius. So we'll do a map search. We'll evaluate other potential leases that are coming up. Obviously, if it's an agency that has multiple locations, it seems to be an easier fit than multiple agencies in one lease. And then it transitions from our end, which is there a real estate opportunity to do it, to the agencies themselves, understanding if they can cohabitate.
Okay, and it just got a response from Catherine. It sounds like you did answer the question, but that it doesn't sound like Oregon has any surplus or vacant state-owned property at this point.
Okay, good. Yeah, we've got lots of land, just not enough buildings.
Okay, do we have any other questions? It sounds like we have one more in the works that that we may have here shortly. But are there any other questions from any of the attendees for the presenters that we have today at this point? Okay, we're waiting on one question, which we should have John back online here in a minute.
Okay, does the state agency need to obtain the option? Okay.
Okay, well, I'm seeing no new questions coming in.
I think Bert, we see one that just popped up.
I think there's one from John. Does a state agency need to obtain 3 options or just one? And with reference to his previous question, I would guess that's around buildings. Purchase an existing building. Okay, so that's a great question. And Oregon is, I don't know if we're unique to this or not, but, and this is one of the changes we made in the leasing initiative as well. But the short answer is that real estate is not governed by public procurement laws. So we don't have to treat, you know, either buying a piece of property or getting a lease or anything else. We are not bound by those, oh, when they lease a space. Okay, well, I'm kind of getting there in a very roundabout sort of way. No, we don't. We used to, and that was one of the wholesale changes that we made to the leasing process. Every leasing process was treated as like a mini procurement, and it was all very transparent, and I don't need to explain to you how procurement goes. And so one of the changes that we made that came out of that work group, that peer group, was what about our rules and process that needed to change. And we had a ton of rules and a ton of process. And when you dialed it back and looked at what we were tasked with doing and what our constraints were legislatively, there really weren't very many at all. So over the course of time, the agency had, like, you know, stacked process on top of process and then secured it all with a fence of administrative rules. So it did look and feel like procurement. But we dialed all of that back, which kind of that disrupted the market a little bit. So that's where the legislative pressure came in, because all of a sudden we are moving through the market now like any other market player would. You know, we don't have to solicit proposals, as Matt touched on before. We leverage landlords against each other. Again, like anyone else in the market would as well. So that was a huge wholesale change that we did affect, but ironically enough, we never did have to do it in the first place.
Oh, okay. We do have another question again from Lee Fairborn. How are commissions paid on renegotiated leases?
Sure, this is Matt. I'll field it. So on renegotiated leases, landlords pay a commission. This is no different than for private sector clients. when they renew in an existing building. Understanding that sometimes in smaller markets, understanding from market to market, even within a state, that standard could change, and it's important to understand what the market is for a particular market or submarket. And oftentimes it can be the tenor of an entire negotiation can be a bit different, going from a major metropolitan area to a very small rural area. However, what we've identified is that when landlords for renewal are really working hard, not just to negotiate a renewal, but they're worried about keeping the state as a tenant, that's ultimately when we're able to drive the best terms for the state and for the agency.
Right.
And as a follow-up to that, part of that, the renegotiation of existing leases, part of the success around that has been something completely new for the state, and that was executing on the threat of relocation. We, played hardball and said, look, if you don't give us a steal, or if you, don't give us a better deal, market deal, what have you, we will move. And we only had to move twice throughout that whole 2-year period. And I think that, and Matt, you can jump in, I think that really changed the tenor of the larger conversation, because the state had never, ever moved. We stayed in the same place for 43 years, renewing for every 2 years. And then all of a sudden we just take stakes and we moved. And I think that got a lot of attention and got us some credibility in driving those better deals and fair market deals.
Yeah, I'd say that's correct. After the first 2 moves, about 10 buildings around the state of Oregon that had state leases with a few years left went on the market for sale.
Wow. And we did get a note from Carl in Virginia that says, yes, the process is the same in Virginia, not subject to public procurement, but we try to facilitate competition through an RFP in the different Virginia marketplaces for leased property.
Oh, we do that to an extent. We issue a request for information, and essentially an RFP, and that's just kind of to canvass the market. And a lot of times we also use that as we are obligated to notify publicly, issue public notification for any lease over 10,000 square feet. So we kind of use that as kind of a double tool that way. In the end, we do use RFPs, but they're market industry RFPs, and so it's really more of a conversation document and not a procurement document.
Okay, and I got a note from John Boyle in North Dakota that said we implement the same strategy for any lease over 10,000 square feet. So it sounds like we do have a little bit of consistency in how we do things across the country, at least in some areas.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, we are nearing the top of the hour. Do we have any other questions, or are there any closing comments that any of our presenters would like to make before we wrap the webinar up for the day?
No, this is Chris from Leland. I just want to thank everybody for joining the webinar. We, along with Cushman, are NASFA members, and we really welcome everybody to send us email questions, utilize NASFA's email blast process to ask questions that you have, either following up on the webinar or anything else related to portfolio optimization. And as well as email Shannon and her generosity in making herself available. Both Leland and Cushman will be at the Western NASFA conference in Santa Fe in September, so we hope to see some of you there for those out west in our neck of the woods. But don't just think of us geographically as Western. We certainly can answer questions from any state in the country. And if anybody else has any other.
No, I just want to thank Shannon too for taking the time to do this, and hope it was valuable for our audience.
Yes, and please do feel free to reach out, and maybe we can pull that blog together, because I think it'd be fantastic to continue to collaborate. So thank you so much for your time.
Okay, and I would like to thank all of the attendees for participating and all of the really great and thoughtful questions that we got, and our presenters for taking the time out of their day and spending an hour with us to talk about real estate and leasing as it relates to the work that they've done in the state of Oregon. I am planning to be in the West, so we will see you at that conference when the time comes. And for those of you that are in the East or Southeast, we are also having a Southeast and East combined regional conference in October, and all of that information is on the NASFA website. So please go to that and take a look at it. If you're interested in coming to Richmond in the latter part of October. I think it's the October 25th and 26th, I believe, are the dates. So with that small commercial, I will again thank everybody for participating today, and we'll bring the webinar to a close. So thank you all very much.